Hi, welcome everybody to a new episode of the Doomer Optimism podcast. Today, Ashley and I are talking with Scott Johnson, who is the founder and director of the Low Technology Institute. Scott, why don't you introduce yourself, give us a little bit of your backstory and how you came to found a
All
low tech
right.
institute and the kind of stuff that you guys work on.
Sure. I guess in the beginning, I started in northern Minnesota. That's where I'm from. Kind of lived all over through an exchange year abroad and in Germany, and then came back and went to college in Boston and then New Orleans for grad school. And that was all archaeology. Mostly. I'm an archaeologist by training, and I finished my Ph.D. in anthropology, which is kind of the umbrella for archaeology and a couple other social sciences. And I was teaching and just was on the adjunct treadmill, which I'm sure we don't need to get into today. And I just kind of started thinking about society in general, large scale rise and fall of ancient civilizations. And I was writing a book at the time called Why Ancient Civilizations Failed, which was not my title. I wanted to call it Hubris, which is something we can talk about if you want. But basically, my idea was that societies become so enamored of themselves that they stop paying attention to changing environmental factors. I don't just mean climate environment, I mean things around them, their surroundings. And then they when they stop paying attention to their surroundings, things change and then they collapse because they think, oh, we've farmed this way for 1,000 years and it's worked, so why would we change, right? And then, of course, being the all-seeing eye of Sauron myself, I looked at these ancient civilizations, bad word, I know, complex societies. And then I looked at our own and I thought, well, we're kind of addicted to fossil fuels and we haven't planned for the end of those. And I kind of got depressed um, and found places like the Dark Mountain Project and others who were kind of on the same page. And eventually I said, okay, enough of this academic run around. I'm going to start doing something where I can do hands-on research projects and center them around small-scale DIY solutions to a lot of how we're going to live after fossil fuels are no longer around. So there's, I guess, kind of the doomer part, my depression about where we're going, and the optimism part about, hey, there are things you can do right now that not only make you more resilient in a future without fossil fuels, but also today when prices go up. It's like, okay, grocery store prices are going up. I don't care because we grow a lot of our own food. And it's not like we have a lot of land to do it on. You can grow a lot of your own food in your own space. So stuff like that. That's kind of what we're all about. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we have a research wing. It makes it sound very grand. A research wing that does research on everything from growing potatoes, solar hot water, and breeding bees and growing food. A lot of it's food related. And then we have an educational wing where we have classes on a lot of the topics we cover. Next year, we hope to do a whole series on timber framing as we build a building for our institute, things like that. So we're trying to do a lot of stuff, hands-on, local, small-scale stuff. That's basically what we're all about.
Cool. Well, that's a great sort of 30,000 foot view. Um, Super interesting stuff going on. I want to mention the Low Tech Institute's website, lowtechinstitute.org.
Oh, yeah.
Great website. I've been exploring it. I think a person could easily spend a month looking through all the resources you got on there. You've got videos, you've got podcasts, you've got a lot of how-to stuff, you've got descriptions of projects that you've worked on, you've got white papers and other sort of philosophical materials and stuff. So I definitely encourage everybody to go see lowtechinstitute.org and check out the stuff you got. I want to step through things a little bit slower and maybe ask you questions about your process and things that were formative for you. So you did your PhD in archaeology and anthropology, and you worked a lot with Mayan communities in Mesoamerica, Latin America. So could you give like a little description of the kind of stuff that you were doing with those communities and maybe some salient experiences that you had, what you learned working with those communities and how it's affected your path?
Yeah. So what you guys were talking about on a previous episode actually resonated with me because I know you've had lots of people on who have worked in different parts of the I guess you'd call it less industrialized part of the world, which is I think a better phrasing than say more or less developed, because assumes development is required. So I lived in Guatemala for a while. I also lived most of my time working in the field was in Mexico in a small village just south of Chichen Itza, which is many people know. I was 15 minutes south of there, but kind of a world away, because 15 minutes away was Chichen Itza, where they had the buses coming in with thousands of tourists every day, and very first world sort of experience. And then I was 15 minutes away, but never went to town. To get a cell phone signal, I had to climb up the tallest tree on the tallest pyramid, and then I could call home. So still connected, but barely. And so we had like one outlet in the house we lived in, and so this was an experience that touched me a lot, because people have been living in so many different ways across the ancient world and today, that it makes me so disappointed that sometimes we get such a narrow view of what it is to live a good life. And I don't want to romanticize living the way that they did, or that they do in rural parts of Mexico, because there are, access to healthcare, and over influx of processed sugars and processed foods nowadays has given rise to high diabetes and a lot of health conditions. So that, and education, and many I could list, right? There's a lot of difficulty. So I don't mean to romanticize it, but the fact that if something terrible, catastrophic were to happen to world trade, I think they would continue to live a lot more comfortably than many of us would, and that made me happy and sad, I guess. But I don't know. I think about it, and I try and draw ideas from them, and then from not only them, but across the world, both today and in the past, and take those ideas and analyze them in a bit of a more scientifically rigorous way, with a control and an experimental plots of different vegetables or different plants I'm growing, or methods I'm using, to kind of get a comparison. Because a lot of people in the alternative agriculture, or alternative energy, or alternative XYZ community, they'll say, "Oh, this is a great idea. I'm going to try it," and they try it, but there's no control, so you don't know if it's doing better than it would otherwise. So yeah, I try and draw from them, and draw from that type of idea, but also, I'm not opposed to technological solutions when they're necessary. And for example, we're on Zoom right now, and I don't think anyone listening on a podcast would be able to listen to these ideas if we didn't have the communication infrastructure that we do. So there are some things that I think are important to try and preserve as we move in transition into this brave new world that's coming at us, whether we like it or not. Whereas some things that I think we can jettison pretty easily.
So people hear that you're an archaeologist, and that you're, living and working in the Yucatan. They're going to think that you're maybe going around digging up bones and old pyramid sites and stuff like that. So when you're there working with the communities there, were you running around digging up bones and stuff, or were you studying contemporary practices? Were you studying ancient practices, or what were you focused on there?
Sure. So for me, at least for my dissertation, which has the actual topic of my dissertation had only in a very, very broad sense anything to do with what I'm doing today. I was looking at a complex political change in the past. And so, yes, I was going around every day. We'd walk 2 kilometers out to the site from the village I was staying in, of about 300 people who grew up speaking Maya as their primary language and then learned Spanish in school. And so we'd walk out to the site every day, and we would, first we had to survey. So we had to cut straight lines through the forest, and use survey equipment, and identify where all the structures were and the topography of the land, to kind of recreate what this little tiny village looked like. It was about the same size as the village we lived in now. And then the next year we did surface collections and excavations to get pottery. We were primarily focused on pottery because pottery sequence changes over time. Just like, if you were digging through a trash bin or a trash pit from, the last century, you'd see different Coke bottles, because Coke bottles change over time, and you could then date which each layer was, right? So we basically were doing that, but with pottery that was 1,000 years old. And what we were looking at with all this, just little mundane bits of everyday pottery that, John Q. Maya just kind of threw out when it broke, was actually a really interesting change in that for 400, 500, 600 years, there was a local, large scale, more or less socio-political control or regime. And then after what's called the Maya collapse, which interestingly affected two interesting points in the Maya collapse, which some people like to talk about. Number one, collapse is kind of a loaded word, because the thing that collapsed were the upper levels of societies, the people that were building the large pyramids, the rulers, the people that were not subsistence farmers. Subsistence farmers largely just scattered into the forest and picked up and continued living. So there was a lot of resilience, and it affected 10% of the population a lot. So saying it was a collapse is a little disingenuous. And number two, it happened more in the southern area that was more dependent on rainfall. Where I worked was practically a desert. It was a scrub. I forget the exact Copland designation of it, but it was a scrub forest near a desert. It was pretty. It was kind of like Texas. It was pretty hot, dry, limestone. No water stayed on the surface. Very little soil. Anyway, so these people weathered the drought really well because they already had drought resilient strategies. So they just kind of kept chugging along. And then what happened to them was a maritime empire that Chichen Itza represents came in and was an intrusion. And then so I was looking at this little village that was almost equidistant between Chichen Itza and the old capital. And I wanted to see, how did this so-called massive shift from one regime to another manifest itself on the local level for small, everyday people? And it didn't really. I mean, they just paid tribute to someone else. So they didn't care. I mean, as far as I could tell, very little change. So a lot of times when we think of these big catastrophic world-ending changes, a lot of that doesn't affect the little people. Now, this was at a time when people were subsistence farmers and could go out into the landscape and create their own living, which is kind of different than most of us today. Maybe present company excluded, but they're for the majority of population, a disruption of that level would be catastrophic to their daily way of life. And so that, in addition to other things, kind of pushed me to say, okay, well, can we build this resilience into our lives now, knowing that we do have this change coming? Make ourselves more resilient and more self-sufficient. Also is a word I'm trying to get away for. Maybe locally resilient or locally sufficient rather than self-sufficient, because I think in America we all like to think we could be self-sufficient, but nobody's self-sufficient unless you are able to get ore out of the ground and become a blacksmith and do all of these things. You are not self-sufficient. And do that with everything. You are not self-sufficient. You are interdependent on other people around you.
Yep.
Even as a rugged individualist out on the frontier.
Yes. Okay. This is so good. I can totally see the straight line between your research and the Low Tech Institute, because it's basically like in the situation where there's like complex systems collapse, people can still thrive if they're able to sort of like meet their needs on like a local or community or bioregional level. So it very much ties in with a lot of the stuff we talk about. Is just, I think a lot of people who have studied history or lived in the developing world think this similar or less industrialized world think in the similar way, which is like I think realizing how precarious our lives are, those of us who don't have these skills and have very little ability to provide for our own basic needs. And so like preparing for that in advance is smarter than not doing it. There's so much overlap too with my experience and maybe Josh's experience too. It might be interesting. We talked a little bit about it on your podcast, or when we interviewed you, Josh, but I do think there is something to spending time outside of the developed world, like the hyper industrial world, to give you a set of perspective, like, a perspective about how other people live, how it's pretty accessible to live sustainably and with low resource input on a community level. And you realize like you don't need a ton of resources to get by, to eat, to have warm water, a warm and dry place to sleep. I traveled to Guatemala and had this similar kind of insight at the Pyramid Tikal. Do you know that one?
Yep.
And
Mm-hmm.
just seeing like, yeah, there was this complex civilization, and you know, it sort of went away, but you know, like we persist throughout time. So okay, one thing that a lot of people who are, I think, thinking in this type of way, had this kind of set of experience, interested in complex societies of the past, are like trying to figure out what can we draw from the past, what can we draw from anthropology, the study of past civilizations, like what's relevant for us, and what should we be modeling, but obviously like in the modern context. And so one thing that has been coming up a bunch recently is, and this would be great to get your opinion on before we get into like the more modern work that the work you're doing at LTI, but are there like would you call what the Mayan civilization or the Mayan society you were studying, would you call that a civilization or not? And there was some debate recently on Twitter about whether or not a civilization, if once it gets to the point where it's a civilization, it's necessarily unsustainable. And I feel like there are lots of extremely varied examples of complex societies in the past, you might call them civilizations, that lasted like very long, very like thousands of years, with decent amount of complexity, and they only collapsed because of some change in the ecosystem or change in the climate, or you know, the ice age, or the ice age going away, these kinds of major changes. So I'm wondering, like, as an anthropologist, I feel like it's important to make this distinction, like civilizations are unsustainable, and because then that has implications for us, right? Because I get a little frustrated sometimes where people are like, any amount of complex organization among humans is going to be unsustainable, and then it's like, well, where does that leave us? I mean, do we have to like simplify to such an extent, you know? And I think it's a little bit like this fetishizing indigeneity of the past and stuff like that in it too. So I don't know, I've been curious to hear your thoughts since you're trained in this area.
Sure. Sorry, I'm just taking notes because there's like 7 it's a complex question.
We could just
so first of all, yeah, so okay, so civilization, so the term itself, civilization, it's in the title of my book, but like I said, that's not my choice, because civilization has become, at least in anthropology, a dirty word, because you may already know, your listeners may already know, that civilization comes from a tripartite division from anthropology in like 150 years ago, when there was a lot of European colonialism, and they put everybody in the world into 3 categories. You are either a savage, a barbarian, or civilized, which is really not, we don't want to use those terms anymore, although civilization has stuck around and become really difficult to shake. So that word is still here for better or worse. I try not to use it. Like I said, I prefer the term complex societies, or large scale complex societies. And that just refers to when you have a lot of people living together, it becomes incredibly complex, because it's almost like an exponential growth of complexity the more people you have grouped together closely and communicating. And so today, for example, we talk about maybe services divisions, band, tribe, chiefdom, state as ways to talk about how many people are living together. And the important difference is from the savage barbarian civilization idea was there was an arrow. Everybody started out in the savagery, and then you move to barbarism, and then you move to civilization. So a lot of the colonialism was to try and pull these quote unquote, I apologize for using this word, but I'm just historically speaking, they said, we are going to these places of savagery and trying to bring them into civilization. That's again, why we don't use that word.
Yeah, that's the language of the past.
Yeah, so it's really problematic, I guess, if you want to be historical about it. Anyway, so band, tribe, chiefdom, the important difference there is no presumed movement from band to tribe, from tribe to chiefdom, from chiefdom to state. That's sometimes how it progresses, but that doesn't have a value judgment on it. A state isn't necessarily better than a band. Bands are egalitarian. Bands move across the landscape. They're largely nomadic hunter-gatherers. People in bands have long lifespans. They have really good health because they're not living in the same place, polluting that one environment. They're moving around. They're eating a varied diet. Bands, when you move to a tribe or chiefdom, those are usually agricultural. And when you move from a band to sedentary agricultural lifestyle, you see shorter stature, which is kind of an indication of poor nutrition, really, because it's only in the last 50 years that we have attained the height of average hunter-gatherers before agriculture, because we have such a robust industrial food production system right now. 50 years before that, everyone was a lot shorter, going back 10,000 years, because they were eating monocrop wheat and things like that. So we're trying to get away from that value judgment. So that's civilization. That's why I try and use the term complex.
So my question society. Is then, like, once you get to chiefdom state level, is it necessarily unsustainable at that level?
No, but it's easier to be.
Okay.
Right.
That makes sense.
When you have, I like to say, for example, because my big bugaboo is fossil fuels, I say that fossil fuels kind of hypercharge all the best and the worst about us, right? They help us produce tons of food, but they also help us destroy the environment at an increased rate. One person with an excavator could, cause so much soil damage and erosion that they could, completely destroy a wetland ecosystem easily. A single person, right? I mean, that's only possible because of fossil fuels. It would be real hard to do that with a shovel. Possible, but it would be a lot more dedicated. Anyway, and similarly with hundreds of or thousands of people working together in pre-industrial societies, canalization is a big one. Deforestation is a big one. These are ways that, more people living in a concentrated area, it's a lot easier for them to destroy their environment or change their conditions in a way that make it unsustainable in the long run. That doesn't mean it can't be sustainable. And a lot of people like to romanticize, for example, Native Americans, First Nations, societies here, and they forget that when Europeans encountered Native Americans in many places, it was right after a plague had killed off anywhere from 50 to 90% of the population. And so you had a very diminished population living with the infrastructure and the large resources of a much larger society. And the same thing happened in Europe after the bubonic plague. Because land is finite, as the population increases, there's less resources, or less land and less resources available for each individual person. And so after the bubonic plague wiped out a third of Europeans, suddenly there's extra land for growing food, there's extra housing, there's all this extra availability because all of the dead people don't need it anymore. And so people actually had a boom, an economic boom, and a high quality of life after all of these people died off. And so it's easy to romanticize. And I'm not saying that we can't learn a lot of really good lessons from Native American agriculture and even social organization. My favorite anecdote was that a lot of Native societies would divide, property rights were matrilineal. They passed through the mothers to their daughters. And then a lot of the other societal organizations were patrilineal. They passed through men. And so women owned the land, men did provide a lot of the labor. And so it was kind of there had to be more mutual respect, right, between the two, rather than men owning a lot of the land and providing a lot of the labor. And then, it's easier to be less egalitarian. And so sometimes when the Europeans would meet, they'd want to talk to the whoever was ruling that village, and they would think that the woman was acting as a translator for her husband when she was actually in charge. And they kept talking to the man, and he'd be like, "Well, ask my wife." And there's a lot of cultural confusion, let alone language confusion. So there's a lot of really useful things, and I don't mean to disregard that, but it's important to keep everything in perspective. So can large-scale civilizations be sustainable? Yes, they can, but they have to be very self-reflective. And I feel like as societies become more powerful, they become less self-reflective in a realistic way. And they feel that they have the answers. This is how it works. And if we don't, and we don't need to change, we can change the world around us. And I feel like this really feeds onto our technophilia. I was just hearing a story on NPR this morning about a hedge fund or some sort of thing on Wall Street where they bundle a lot of investments for a very technological future, very bullish on technology saving us. And the anthropologist James C. Scott has the idea of high modernism, and this is a robust, almost religious belief in technology going to save us. And I have sympathy for this. I have family members who think we're going to innovate our way out of this, and I say, okay, maybe, but until that happens, I'm going to plan for things that I know work, like growing lots of potatoes, like growing wheat, growing things locally, being locally self-sufficient. That's what I'm going to focus on until we have, carbon capture that is energy neutral and all of these wonderful things that people are trying to work on. And, everybody has an electric car that doesn't have a really terrible supply chain for its lithium batteries and all these things. That's what it's going to be, right? No, I can't predict the future, but yeah, I'll focus on things that have a proven track record and make them better and more obtainable, rather than, refocusing on something new that's going to save us.
Yeah, theoretical.
The new has gotten us into this problem.
Right.
Yeah, if it's cool, I'd like to jump in. You were just describing, I think, a concept that's central to your book on the decline of civilizations. And that's the concept of social hubris, which my understanding is that that's a unique contribution that you're making to the scholarship, where a number of people have studied decline of civilizations and things like that. Joseph Tainer and Jared Diamond and other people have written on this topic, but your work has focused a lot on this concept of social hubris, and like you're saying, kind of almost like a religious belief in the ability of an emergent elite to solve problems, which induces rigidity and a lack of adaptability and so on. So I wonder, that sounds like an extremely valuable contribution of your work. And so if you could elaborate on that a little bit more and maybe talk about, you mentioned an example there with the NPR story, but just talk about how you see that playing out in our civilization. And you've studied like the Mayan civilization, and so you studied these groups, and you noted early on in our conversation that the collapse phenomenon had much greater of an impact on the elites of the society, because they were in a more sort of, I guess, vulnerable or fragile position with greater dependency, whereas the sort of, the plebes or whatever, the subsistence farmers pretty much soldiered along as they always had. Maybe they had paid tribute to a different leader, but their lives didn't change very much. And so the question I have is this concept of social hubris that you see as being an important determining factor in the life cycle of civilizations or complex societies. Is this something that disproportionately affects elites? And if so, how do you see it affecting our elites? And if so, do you see any potential for dissuading people or disabusing elites of these maladaptive notions?
$1 million question.
Oh man. So do I think the elites in our society have hubris about our way of life? Yes. That's pretty clear. I appreciate that softball. So let's see. So where to start? So social hubris, yeah. So basically, in a nutshell, like I kind of said before, as a society becomes more established and successful, they often expand the way that has made them successful. For pre-industrial societies, this was, a suite of agricultural technologies, a suite of social technologies, often a suite of technological technologies. So like iron or bronze or things like that, and basketry and pottery and all these different things. And so they would, often, spread this knowledge base out and expand and get new converts, if you like, to this way of life. And they would become larger and more successful and and in a certain environment. And then that environment, and again, it could be social environment, it could be trade, it could be other things, changes. And they say, well, we've lived this way for 1,000 years, or let's say 500 years. We've lived this way for 500 years. And, this is how my answers are done. I've been the I've been part of the same ruling family or, larger family for, going back 30 generations. And that's true in some places. Why would I change now? Why would we stop? Why would the Mesopotamians stop growing their agriculture the way they were just because their fields were becoming saline, filling with salt because of the way they irrigated? Why would the Romans stop their economic expansion even though they physically couldn't do it anymore because they'd reached the edges of the world and their trade was breaking down? Why would the Aztecs and Incas, who were absolute rulers, absolute monarchs who were in place because the gods had decreed that they would rule. They had absolute fervent followers. Why would they have to worry about 100 smelly, hairy foreigners who showed up in a boat on the coast who are walking towards us? We live in a city that was built out of reclaimed land, out of a drained swamp with aqueducts, a huge market, thousands, tens of thousands of warriors, hundreds of thousands of people living us around us, all working together to make this one of the biggest, cleanest cities in the world at the time. I'm talking about Tenochtitlan, which became, Tenochtitlan, which became Mexico City. When the Europeans arrived, it was one of the biggest cities in the world, and they remarked on how clean it was. And it was in a swamp, and they said it was clean, it smelled like flowers, it was beautiful. London at the time was a cesspit, so why would we, who are the creators of this amazing city, this amazing empire, have to worry about 100 of these smelly foreigners who showed up? We shouldn't have to worry about it, and they shouldn't have, but history shows Cortez taking over through a lot of duplicity and terrible things, as well as disease. So all of these societies, in hindsight, it's really easy to say, oh, well, they should have seen that coming. And something you said a minute ago, Ashley, about there being, kind of something that changes, that causes their collapse. And that's kind of also something we're getting away from and maybe you didn't mean it like this, but a lot of times people say, what was the cause of the Maya collapse? Which is almost the wrong question, because it's plural. What were the causes? Because a lot of times these collapse type things or these transitions come because of a cascade of collapses or a cascade of failures in many sectors. If the Maya had faced just a drought, it wouldn't necessarily have caused a collapse or a major social transition. It's because there was decayed rulership, there was lack of innovation in economics, there was a lack of innovation in other areas, vulnerable that when they had a drought, it undercut everything else. And so it's not necessarily a silver bullet that brings them down, but it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. There's already a hay bale on top of the camel's back, and then you put one more straw and it drops. So, maybe the precipitating cause was that drought, but there was already a lot of weight on the back of that proverbial camel. So, something you just said, Josh, made me think, I never framed it this way. So when I'm talking about ancient societies, there is a 1-to-1 correlation between the elites and the non-food producers or the non-subsistence growers, because in basically across the ancient world, you see about a 10-to-1 ratio or a 9-to-1 ratio. About 90% of societies pre-industrial were involved primarily in growing food, and 10% were either administrative or rulers and or craft specialists. So your blacksmiths, your potters, your weavers, people that made things and then sold them to get food or traded to get food, right? So it was about a 9-to-1 ratio. And so when we talk about collapse of the elite segment of society, those people are not necessarily able to fend for themselves in the environment, in their surroundings. Now, today we're different, where we've kind of reversed that ratio, right? Maybe not, I don't even know if it's 10% of people that grow our food. It's probably less than that.
In the US, it's like 2%.
2%, right. And so when we have a collapse of the system that supports basically our infrastructure for transportation and agricultural production, we're not at we're not a society where 90% of us know how to grow all our own food and can survive on our own. We are not that society. So in the past, that transition, and I hadn't thought of this because I hadn't thought of it this way before. So thank you for that, mentioning that. Those 10% of people had to figure out how to fit into that new society, but there's still 90% of people growing food. For us, food is going to be a big concern, because without food, most of the rest of our stuff we do is basically pointless, because you're going to starve to death, or descend into some sort of Mad Max hellscape. Right? There's the doomer for you.
And well, so okay, this is so important though, because so even in complex societies of the past, pre-industrial, still 90% of people were involved in food production. Now that's totally essential, because for me, the fossil fuels changed everything in terms of like what we could do for specialization. And like on Twitter, for example, a friend of the podcast, his Twitter name is William Wheelwright, had a tweet go viral that was basically like, you know, if most people kept a few chickens in a garden, we could dismantle the industrial chicken and vegetable industry. And you know, this is just a true observation. If people just produced it themselves, we wouldn't have to have the industrial production. And it went viral, like, you know, all these big name blue checks responded to it like laughing at it, basically, saying like,
seriously?
Yes, like being like, we're not going back in history, like, oh, this is Pol Pot over here, like expecting us to. I know,
back in history.
I know, and like and to me, the hubris of this particular civilization is just so out of control, like just so mismatched. And I think if we were to try to think of a complex society that isn't injected with super cheap energy, it would still, people are like, you know, I don't want to go back to the farms. That's so much hard work. It's like, well, you don't really have a choice. I mean, just a garden is not a big deal. Chickens are not a big deal. And also, like, why do you get to make that choice? You get to make that choice because machines or other humans have to bear that brunt for you. And so I don't know, I'm just going on a rant here, but I think like it's really important to think about the anthropological literature. I mean, humans are an animal. They live inside ecosystems. And so thinking about, even in the ideal best case scenario for a complex society without cheap energy, super amounts of cheap energy, 90% of people are going to have to be involved in growing food in order to make it work.
So
and it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to be like totally subsistent yourself, but just any amount of production.
Right.
But anyway, sorry. Yeah.
I don't think we'd have to go back to 90 to 10%.
Okay.
I think we could do it. I think you could do 50-50, and I don't think you'd have to do 50% of people are chained to the farm and 50% of people are chained to the forge or wherever their avocation takes them. I think you could easily split a lot of this within the same person. I mean, and so what I do is our family, the way my family, my wife works full time, and I grow most of our food, and also do childcare and things like that. But I'm able to grow. We did an entire year. It's called Foodmageddon. You can find it on our YouTube page. There's a playlist called Foodmageddon, or if you just type that into YouTube search. And we did kind of like a mockumentary of the entire year, setting it from the perspective of, if fossil fuels collapsed, especially oil, how would we survive? Could we grow all our own food for a year? And so we lived an entire year where we had this scenario where fossil fuels collapsed in February or so. And so there was knock-on effects. And each month we lost different legs of the stool of external food. So, we couldn't drive to the grocery store. There was very little at the grocery store. Our buying power was reduced because prices would have skyrocketed, yada, yada, yada. Funny thing, we planned to do this in January. We started in January 2020, right before the pandemic started. We had no idea that there was going to be we had we didn't really stockpile, but we bought in extra in January and February. And then all the stockpiling started in, March, and everyone started freaking out. And we're sitting at home on all our flour and stuff. And it worked out really well. And yeah, we were able to go for over a calendar year, basically just on, I grew, gathered, and hunted over 1 million calories myself. That was with my wife working full time. So if it were a real scenario where we would have been able to do 2,000 calories or 2 million calories or more. I feel like once you're working together, you can more than double your output with 2 people and things like that. I feel pretty strongly about that. So we could maybe do 50-50. And one thing you mentioned about the fossil fuels doing all this work for us, maybe you're aware of, I'm sure you've heard of Buckminster Fuller, the kind of philosopher type person around the mid-century. He had this idea called energy slaves. And one day he was sitting in his car thinking about all the horses that would have had to been pulling his car in traffic. And he was sitting in traffic outside of LA, and he's looking at all these cars around him and all this horsepower that was just sitting there idling, being wasted. And he thought, wow, how much horsepower is running everything? How many horses would we have to have? And then he thought, well, how many people would we have to do all this physical work? And this put me down some rabbit hole of like looking at like champion cyclers trying to ride a bike enough to generate power for a toaster. And like this guy with thighs the size of my torso is like pedaling furiously for 10 minutes on a bike, just sweat pouring off him. And the toaster goes ding, and it toasts one piece of toast. And it just illustrates how much energy we take for granted. How many people would we have to have in our basements pedaling nonstop for constantly just to keep the lights on, right? And he pointed out that it's really interesting that industrialization happened just at the point of emancipation, not just in the US, but across the world. As things industrialized, slavery really fell away. Not to say there's not slavery now and there's not terrible things going on right now, but like large scale state sponsored and state supported slavery really fell away as industrialization happened. And causation, correlation, I don't know, but the fact that we had these energy saving devices made it less financially viable even to keep indentured enslaved people. It's cheaper to have a tractor than to have a whole bunch of slaves, right? And also you don't have to deal with all the moral issues. So yeah, please.
So just with a little factoid that you can throw in with, like, it's a great example of, needing a Lance Armstrong to pedal a bike to make one piece of toast, to give a sense of the energy demands and stuff. So there's a great paper by ecological economist Nate Higgins. You can Google, it's on he calls it superorganism. So you can just Google Nate Higgins and superorganism. But he makes the point that if you convert the amount of energy that's in 1 barrel of oil into the equivalent amount of energy of a human being doing physical work, that it comes out to be about 4.5 to 5 years of human labor for 1 barrel of oil. So if we have the question, like, well, why is it that the whole agriculture system switched over to giant machinery and fossil fuels and the Haber-Bosch process and all this kind of stuff? Or what's behind this drive to mechanize everything and to get human labor out of every last thing possible? Well, this ratio of 1 barrel of oil, which maybe today is $100 or something. I mean, if you had to pay somebody to work for 4.5 or 5 years, even at starvation wages, it's going to cost you a lot more than that. And so I think that to me, like, that calculation is really at the root of why so many things have become mechanized and driving fossil fuel dependence. So I guess the question is maybe, or if Ashley has a question, I'm really interested in this question. Like you pointed out, Ashley, that when William Wheelwright made this tweet and then got this just insane backlash, like, how could you say, and this stuff happens all the time. It happened to me yesterday on Twitter, where I suggested to a journalist who was complaining about the high prices of chicken at the grocery store in New York City that she could move to the country and raise her own chickens. And yeah, it was the same, like, how dare you suggest anything like this? That is not an answer.
Yeah, the response was, I live in America. I should be able to buy my food in a grocery store, which I'm like, what? I don't understand how that's like part. I mean, did the founding fathers, is that the vision? Like, that we could just all buy our food in the grocery store? It's just like, it's just made up in like the industrial era, this idea that that's like your God-given right,
Well, and in Latin America, oh, sorry, I was
No,
just going to say in Latin
go.
America, eating meat was a big social symbol. And so I think, purchasing your food is a status symbol, has been a status symbol for 10,000 years. I don't have to grow food. I can trade for food. So it's a big status symbol. You're part of that top echelon of society. So growing your own food can be stigmatized. And in Latin America, for example, meat is, if you eat meat, that means you're, doing well. You can purchase meat because not everyone grew their own meat animals, or if you did grow your own meat animals, you'd only eat them rarely. And so me being a long story, we more or less keep kosher, but means I'm outside the house, I'm a vegetarian. And so in Latin America, me being this, rich grad student coming in, and we'll not get into that. They were like, well, why aren't you eating meat? And I was just like, oh, at the first couple of years, I said, I'm vegetarian. And they looked at me like, why would you not eat meat? And then I realized a year later, I said, oh, it's for a religious purpose. I don't eat meat because of my religion. They're like, oh, that's acceptable, because they had, that fit within their framework. There were people that fasted or didn't eat meat for certain parts of the year because of Catholicism. And so like, oh, it's because you're religious. Oh, okay, cool. That's great that you don't eat meat. And then they were really nice about being, whenever we go visit somewhere, they'd go out of their way to make me something vegetarian, rather than when I said, oh, I don't eat meat, they were like, okay, whatever. So yeah, sorry, just kind of anecdotal.
No, that is
whatever,
no, but I do think
there's a lot of social sigma.
It's the status.
There's a lot of social significance to food. Sorry.
Right. Yeah, and I do think it is a status thing, and I don't mean to be like so dismissive of people, because it is like, okay, you were just raised in this culture where you were able to get everything at the grocery store, and I don't want to be like talking down to people for having just grown up in this world and not really knowing anything else. But I think the takeaway for me, looking back at history and also having traveled around the world, is that the life in the United States, in the most highly developed country, probably the most highly developed country in the history of the world, it's an anomaly. I mean, it's just not historically what anyone like, if we would say, like, think of all of human history, it's just such an anomaly in human history. And then, okay, so if that's the case, like, how do we best prepare for ourselves and our family, more so than just guilting people? But if this journalist, Josh, like, if you can't afford or access food at the stores, like, what do? Do you get mad and just yell into the sky? And you know what I mean? It's like one of those things where I think a lot of people are coming to grips with, there's like these fertilizer shortages and wheat shortages and all of this stuff. And like a lot of people are just coming to grips with this, and their initial reaction is just to like complain about it. And then if you suggest anything like practical that they could do, they're like, oh no, like I just want to yell at politicians or whatever. And so I think the empowering part of our podcast is, you don't have to just be mad. I mean, you can just sit in your house and be mad and then not be able to afford food, or you could, potentially get involved in these different things that not only are good for your resilience and risk aversion, but also kind of fun. So on that topic, I'd like to hear about this 1,000,000 calories that you managed to get yourself. I want to know some of your strategies, like, and I'd like to hear a little bit about the process by which you, like, as this process that we're all going through if we're trying to do this stuff, going from a modern person who doesn't have skills to one that's like attaining skills and figuring it out as you go along. Like, it's not just a physical thing, it's a psychological process. So I'd like to hear your journey with that.
So yeah, there's definitely a learning curve. And yeah, if we had catastrophic collapse tomorrow, I'm hope every community has people in it who still have these skills. And so one of the talks I give is it's called Gardening, the Original Social Safety Net. And I point out that we, as you said, are an aberration in many ways. And one of those ways is that we don't have kitchen gardens even anymore. Until 1900, 1920, every house, even in cities, had either a garden or a plot of land, the European model that still is practiced in places like Germany and Russia. As outside the city, they have garden plots and a little house, and these have become the dachas in Russia, for example. And so people will go out on the weekends and they'll garden, and they come back during the week. And we are unusual in that we are cut off from that. We don't do that anymore. Even during World War I, we all know about victory gardens, and everybody grew a lot of their own food and canned and did all these things. Interestingly, between World War I and World War II, there was so much built up industrial food production that FDR actually discouraged victory gardens during World War II. He said, it is wasteful for us to send you seeds at home because you, gardener at home, are not as good as a factory or as a farm. It's better, it's more efficient for the farm to grow the vegetables and give them to you rather than us to give you seeds. And so they actually actively discouraged victory gardens for the first couple of years of World War II before they gave in and then actually supported them again. But the fact is, I think a lot of us have lost those skills. And so we have to relearn them. And yeah, so when we've been growing, I've been gardening my whole life, pretty much. Even when I lived in an apartment, I would have pots and pots and pots of poorly growing vegetables on the closest I could get to the southern exposure. And we moved out to the country. And when I say the country, we have our plot's 3/4 of an acre. And I also farm a little bit on the neighbor's land. He's a retired market gardener. And so in production, I probably use half an acre or so. So it's not a huge plot of land. It could be a suburban plot. A lot of half-acre suburban plots are out there.
And you're growing grain
so,
too. So does the area that you're farming there that you just described, does that also include the area that you're using for your grain growing?
For grain, I'm sorry.
Yeah, because you said you're also growing grain. You're growing wheat.
Yes.
So the amount of
actually
land,
just before I
the amount of
yes,
land,
that includes grain. So I was just yeah, half-acre includes my wheat. But wheat's not my primary staple. Potatoes are. So in the last 2 podcasts on the Low Technology podcast, or the Low Tech podcast, is talking about potatoes and how they're complete nutrition and they're easier to grow, they're easier to store, they're easier to prepare than wheat. Wheat is a huge process, and yeah, it stores a lot of calories really well, and it's definitely one of the important crops we grow. But potatoes are by far, in an emergency situation, I would rather have my neighbors and I dig up the commons and plant tons of potatoes. Actually, my neighbor, who's a retired market gardener, in the spring of the first year of COVID, so 2020, we said, we don't know what's going to happen with the economy. We don't know what's going to happen. So why don't we just grow a lot of potatoes? And we put in over 1,000 potato plants. We got over a ton of potatoes grown. Most of them got given to a food pantry, which is great. So that 1,000,000 calories does not count those potatoes. We actually grew way more calories than 1,000,000, but the 1,000,000 were the ones I brought in the house. And we were able to give them away, but had things really hit the fan, we had a huge amount of potatoes that we would have given to our neighbors, basically to keep them from storming our houses to take our food.
This is the way, though. I mean, a huge thing that people talk about on this podcast, and also I host this homesteading class, is being a person people look to for resilience, for help, and being an indispensable member of the community. I think being a person in the community that people rely on, this kind of thing. This is who you want to be. You don't want to be on the receiving end of an angry mob. You want to be interdependent, and you want to help other people get to the place that that you're at.
Right. No need for a mob if they have their own food.
Yes.
So one thing you were saying about, you don't want to denigrate somebody who doesn't have the knowledge or the skills to maybe have their own chickens grow their own food. When I lived in St. Louis, and I'll tie this into what you just said in a second. When I lived in St. Louis, we had a garden and chickens and all this stuff. And my neighbor, really nice guy, Eddie, he had lived there before us and after us. And one day I was out in the garden and I said, "Oh, do you want anything?" He's like, "Okay, sure. What are you getting?" And I pulled out some carrots. Beautiful. Like, they were great. I was impressed myself because sometimes carrots are hit or miss for me. And I pulled out these carrots and I offered them to him. He's like, "Oh, no. I don't want those carrots. They came out of the ground." I said, "Don't you like carrots?" He's like, "Oh, I love carrots. I just don't want those. They came out of the ground." And it's like, oh. And then, so I say that anecdote sometimes in talks and people kind of laugh. And I said, yeah, it's kind of funny, but it's also an indictment of the education system.
Yeah.
We lived in a district that was disaccredited. You could not take a high school diploma from there and go to a college. It was a unaccredited district. It's terrible. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. And that guy, who was super nice and friendly, one day he said, if all this goes down, I'm coming over to your house because I know you have food. And I didn't know if he meant that in like a friendly way, like, hey, we're going to work together. Or he's like, I'm going to come take all your food. So we were always really nice to him. Anyway, yeah. So we decided in January to do this project. We started buying in what we could during our time of still having access to fossil fuels, because we were simulating again this collapse, and it wouldn't have happened overnight, right? There's people still trying to continue on as if nothing's happening, and so we ordered in the things we needed, and then we just started planting, and we were able to get through what's usually the hungry period in the early spring, because we had some stuff from the year before, and because we had bought some stuff seeing this happening. We made it easy on ourselves. This happened in the beginning of the year, of the agricultural year, rather than in the middle. That might be a different story. Canning was a big problem. Luckily, I had been thinking like ahead of time. I kind of thought through this year. I'm like, what are our choke points going to be? And I thought, oh, canning lids, right? So we had bought in a whole bunch of those reusable canning lids before they sold out immediately. Thank goodness. Jars it was a fight to get jars. It was a fight, we're at thrift stores getting jars and things like this. So, we had to kind of scramble because of the pandemic. Actually, getting seeds was an issue because of the pandemic. And so it kind of put on a little bit of a patina of reality for us. And so we're growing through the season. We have an abandoned orchard nearby that the land manager said I could have as many apples from if I started managing it. So I've been managing that since then. But there are abandoned resources out on the landscape around us. I also hunted deer on our neighbor's property. That's, a kilometer from my house, so not very far. I transported the deer on my bike on a trailer, which got some looks around here because, hunting such this macho thing. Everyone's got like a truck and, stuff. And here I am, boop, 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 riding up on my bike, and nobody says anything. They're just like, okay, who is this guy? But I did all that. We made sausage. We don't have a chest, or at the time we didn't have a chest freezer. Long story. We broke down and we finally got one because our actual refrigerator, we just had a normal American refrigerator. Our freezer died, and so we ended up getting a chest freezer, and it's been wonderful. Sorry, but we did it without that. So I was canning a lot of the meat. We froze as little as we possibly could because freezing requires constant energy inputs, and we didn't want to do that. So we, can it. That's a single energy input. What really became our choke point was oil, cooking oil. We don't have animals that provide fat for cooking oil, and we didn't have anything to press to make oil. Since then, I bumped into a man named Sam Thayer, who some people may know of, and he presses black walnut oil. And we have tons of black walnut trees, and they just fall on the ground. And we did gather a whole bunch of them, but they're annoying as hell to clean. So we didn't do a lot of black walnut cleaning. But you can just put them in their shell. You husk them, and then you put the shell and everything into these pressers, and you can actually press out the oil, and it's actually decent cooking oil, surprisingly. So we actually have a source of oil. We just didn't have a way to access it. So that for us, that was the big issue. And granted, we live out in the country, so we have our own well water, which we use a reverse osmosis filter on. We have solar panels. We have these things. We have some of the infrastructure. So I'm not saying that somebody in an apartment could do this next year. That would be, you would really have to farm out your work around you somewhere. You'd have to find somewhere that would let you do this. So you do need a bit of space. But if you're in a suburban plot, I grew up in a kind of a suburban house, and we had an acre, and a lot of it was sunny. I mean, I could have done this in any suburban, as long as your HOA or other covenants allow you to actually grow food, which is shocking that growing food is disallowed. And so, yeah, we made it through the next spring. The only things that we cheated on were we had a newborn, so we did buy him milk as he weaned. We did buy him cow milk because we live in Wisconsin. You'd think I could get some raw dairy, but unless you know a person personally beforehand, going and asking to buy raw milk is kind of tricky political and legal thing. So we weren't able to do that. But in a real scenario, I think we would actually have access to milk, because there's going to be all these people with cows and nobody to milk them, because we live in a sparse population. One of the things we also harvested was wheat. We harvested wheat that had been planted the summer before and had grown up, and under the auspices of this anecdotal study we were doing, it wouldn't be harvested because they wouldn't have the petrol, what am I, English? They wouldn't have the gas, the diesel, to harvest it. So I went to my neighbor, who I've been buying straw from for years, and said, hey, could I buy 1/10 of an acre of wheat from you? And he's like, sure. I said, I mean, in the field, like, don't harvest it, I'll harvest it. And he's like, you'll pay for how much I make off of 1/10 of an acre and I don't have to harvest it or do anything? And I said, yeah. He said, okay, if you want. And so I had a class, and we went out and we harvested this 1/10 of an acre. And they were like harvesting and making hay bale or straw bales at the same time. And they were driving their and we're out there with scythes and sickles harvesting all this. And the whole time he's just like, you guys are funny. And then afterwards I told him, yeah, all those people that came to help me, that was a class, and they paid to come do that. And he's like, okay, now that's crazy, right? So but we had a great time. It was actually really fun. And we were able to do it socially distanced, because it was mid-pandemic. We had to all stay apart and use our own implements. It was a whole thing. And then we came home, harvested, threshed it and ground it, and took it home. Turns out industrial wheat's not really great, and I stopped growing it. I didn't grow it. I didn't plant it the next year. I planted a heritage type of wheat that gives us both thatch and bread.
Oh,
and that's what I continue to grow now. I was just watering it this morning, or irrigating it, I guess would be a better term.
Josh, do you have a question?
Sorry.
I have a follow-up.
If you have a follow-up, go ahead. I definitely have a question, but why don't you follow up?
Okay, so just briefly, two things come to mind. One, I think it might be useful for people to just hear like a list that comes off the top of your head of like the densest calories. So you said potatoes. Hunting is crazy, the amount of calories you can get if you can have access to deer. But then I just want to briefly hear so that, and then a brief explanation of like the psychological journey. Like, was it fun? What did you get discouraged?
Sure. So okay, I actually have if you go to yes. It was fun. We missed cheese. I mean, we're in Wisconsin. I know it's cliche, and I'm required by Wisconsin law to say that we miss cheese. But that, we eat every Sunday night. We have pizza, and by the end, we were getting kind of tired of. I had made some cheese and stored it, but it didn't cheddar very well. It was kind of crumbly, more like a feta. It was fine, but cheese. We actually have on our website, one of our blog posts is called "Calories Grown in Foodmageddon." So if somebody wants to get a really microscopic view of what we grew, I recorded it all there. If you just go to lowtechinstitute.org and then search for calories grown in Foodmageddon, you'll find it. But yeah, the biggest, so most of our time was spent in the garden, right? Easily growing vegetables was the most intensive thing we did. And that actually only got us a total of 125,000 calories, 12%, 12.5%, 13%. But I like to say the vegetables made a lot of the other calories more palatable to eat, right? Garlic, carrots, cabbage, broccoli, kale, lettuce, okra, peas, pumpkins, even potatoes were included in that. Not as many calories, but it made everything a lot more palatable. The biggest gathered stuff, we did apples. I did many calories. I did about 118,000 calories of gathered things, including maple syrup. We did 4 gallons of maple syrup. That's really energy intensive. We got 46,000 calories just from maple syrup. Then we did raspberry and jams and things like that. But those were added in sugars that we wouldn't have had the next year. Honey is a pretty good one. The grains, wheat, we did wheat, just a 1/10 of an acre of wheat. We got 600,000 calories. Whoa. So there's like the bulk of it. So that's why wheat has been so important for, the staple for so long. But processing it takes forever. It took me, over a week. So the time put into it was excessive, but it was a lot. We grew a lot of wheat. Unfortunately, that industrialized wheat, the dwarf wheat, it was hard red winter wheat. It was terrible for making bread. It was just terrible. The wheat I grow now is so much better. It has higher gluten and protein and all that. So, and then yeah, animal. We had a lot of eggs. We have chickens. We had 28,000 calories of chicken eggs, and then another 10,000 calories of chickens. We didn't push meat birds real heavily because we basically had to freeze them and our freezer space was limited. Venison was 85,000 calories, and then honey was 55,000 calories. So those were the more energy. Our potatoes were about 67,000 calories. We could do more potato. We could have done, that's not counting the potatoes we gave away. We actually grew many, many, many more because it's 354 calories per pound, and we probably grew over a ton of them. So, and we gave away thousands of pounds. So yeah, I only kept about 200 pounds, and that was 67,000 calories. So,
wow.
So we could have done more on potatoes. So in this recent podcast where I talk about potatoes, if you were to put in 40 hours of work, you could grow 2/3 of your calories in potatoes for a year. So in 40 hours of work, you grow 2/3 of your calories. So that's equivalent. It's better than wheat, and you don't need specialized equipment. That's the thing with wheat. I had to build a mini thresher. And you can see this in our YouTube. I'm doing a series right now on home scale grain production. I just put out the first video last week about seeding and planting, and then I'll do a harvesting and then I'll do a video on processing and using the grain later in the season as I have them available. But yeah, potatoes are a lot less work, and they store easily, and they're go
and
for
40
potatoes.
hours. I mean, one work week.
40
and
hours.
This is what people are like crying about on Twitter. Well, you know, I don't want to quit my job and get back into the field. It's like 40 hours, dude. It's not that hard, and it's like exercise. You go to a gym and move plates of metal around. So okay, sorry for the psychological aspect, and then I'll let Josh go, and then I have one other question.
Oh yeah, of course. So psychological aspect. Yeah, so it did take, just like you guys were talking about. Oh shoot, no, I'm sorry, I wasn't on a different podcast of yours. I was recently on a panel, French Embassy, about low-tech innovations, and one of the people there was on solar cooking, and she said you just have to think about changing. Oh no, you did say this. I think Ashley, you were saying about you have solar hot water, and you have to just kind of shift when you shower, and it just takes a little bit of onboarding, and then you're ready to go. And so that's kind of how it was for us. We had been growing a decent amount of our own food, so it was really just, it was gradual kind of dipping into it. And it's like the frog being in the pot with the temperature going up. We did it gradually, so it wasn't a huge shock to us. Also, we knew we had the safety net of this wasn't really happening. So psychologically, it wasn't stressful. If it was really happening, it would have been psychologically stressful, I think, for other reasons. But, with COVID in there, it was pretty stressful. We did Zoom birthdays for my kid, and we did, never seeing our family for so long. What was really weird was going back to the grocery store. Even though we've been going in for milk, we just dart in, get the milk, and leave, really. So, and you kind of had the blinders on, thinking none of this is available to me. So psychologically, it's like it wasn't there. And then the first time we went to the grocery store after this was over, it was kind of overwhelming, and we kind of overbought because we're like, ooh, I haven't had oranges. Ooh, I haven't had, bananas. Ooh, blah, blah, blah. And so we just bought all kinds of stuff. So then you could see how psychologically different it was. So yeah, it would have taken on a lot more serious tone if we were forced to do it, but it was voluntary, so it was somewhat enjoyable. We each had and because of the pandemic, we did one cheat meal a week where we would take out from the restaurant to help support restaurants that weren't able to have people in them. So once a week we would buy a takeout meal, and we each had a cheat treat kind of thing. So my wife had chocolate, I think, and I had tea. So we each had, one thing that we could get just to help psychologically keep us, because we didn't, we're doing this for fun. We don't want to, we're not taking on a vow of poverty or anything like, but yeah, if this were really to happen, it would be a different story psychologically, I think.
Yeah, I had a tweet like, oh, if global supply chains totally break down, can I please still have chocolate? I don't know who I was asking, but that was like the one thing. Josh, you go ahead, and then I have one final question.
Okay. Another thing I wanted to highlight, Scott, about your work is that, and it's on the website there at Low Tech Institute, and you've done a number of research projects like on non-mechanized methods of potato cultivation for market gardeners, trying to develop strains of bees that are resistant to the mites that cause colony collapse. Some work on composting and other really practical projects. And you've had some success actually getting funding for these from USDA and from other places. It's something we've talked about a lot on this podcast is this idea of the emergence of what we think of as like para-academic research and education, you know? And so you're demonstrating that you can do research, you can get small grants for these practical things, you're teaching courses and you're doing outreach and that sort of thing. And as we're talking about, like this stuff is not hard, it's enjoyable. Many people can do this. Many, many more people could be doing this than are currently doing it. But there's maybe some psychological barriers that come from culture and so on. So the question I want to ask is, since you've had success in some of this para-academic research and education, what are some lessons learned about effective outreach and about recruiting more people into taking on this kind of stuff?
I imagine you talk about it a lot because it's difficult. Unfortunately, I don't have the silver bullet for that one either. For funding, at least, just like in grad school or academics in general, you look at your funder, you read as much as you can about them and their background and what they are trying to do, and then tailor your work, present it in a way that it tailors with what they're doing. So for one of my most successful granting partners, I guess, is the USDA's SARE, Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education Grant. And those are I aim them at market gardeners, because market gardeners are growing at a scale that is approachable for a household, but also produce a lot of food. And so, yeah, like you said with the potatoes, I was able to say, like I did a background literature research as part of my grant funding request. And I said, nobody's looked at the most effective way to grow potatoes without machines, because there's no money in it necessarily. But if you're a market gardener, you don't want to have a huge, toe behind potato excavator. I don't even know the term of it because I don't use it. But you don't want to have that expensive piece of equipment sitting around to grow a couple, 1,000 pounds of potatoes to sell at the farmer's market. You're going to do it by hand. And so we wanted to make sure that people were doing it the most effective way they could. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, for that organization, I pitch everything as market gardeners. So they call them market farmers, because that's what the grant is for. And it does help them. And we're doing one right now with a composting study where, are you guys aware of New Alchemy Institute? Yeah, okay, Josh is nodding yes. Ashley, no. New Alchemy Institute was set up on Cape Cod or in Massachusetts in the 70s and 80s with some biologists. And they were really keyed into what was going to happen with the environment and oil and things like that in that time period. And they came up with things like basically an Earthship greenhouse back in the 70s and 80s. They did work on aquaponics, where you're growing, not aquaponics, sorry, where you're growing fish as well. Yeah, that's aquaponics.
No, aquaponics,
yeah. They did early pioneering research on that. I mean, it's amazing. There's this really hokey 70s documentary about it from the BBC or from the Canadian Film Board or something. If you Google for it, you can find it. New Alchemy Institute. It's really cool. Anyway, they were a big inspiration for us, and they did a lot of this research. And so, yeah, we tried to replicate some of that. And one of the things they did was they built a greenhouse where the north side had a bank of bays, and they would shovel horse manure into there, and then it had a blower system. It would blow oxygen air through the static pile. So it's a static aerated pile, and that would then off gas nitrogen compounds, moisture, heat, and CO2, which is exactly what plants need to grow. And so then they would capture that gas and pump it through wood chip piles under grow beds. And then basically they would pump everything the plants need into the bed. And they grew greens year round in Massachusetts, but they had to change out 12 yards of horse manure every month, which is a chore. I do a yard every week. And so basically what I'm doing, I'm trying to come up with a modular system so that you don't have to have a dedicated greenhouse for this, and it's scalable. And so what I first did was I built these, I call them hot boxes. they were 1 yard cubes with a grow bed on top, and then you would replace the horse manure each month, and blow air through them, and it would, put out the stuff into the grow beds on top. I didn't realize how heavy those grow beds were on top. So I've completely scrapped that idea. I'm breaking them down. I'm doing a different thing with a tarp, a heavy duty tarp, and a pipe, and it's in flux. But these are the types of things that are approachable and doable. And so, yeah, small scale sorts of things. The bees are one. So it's difficult. And as far as outreach to other people go, this maybe sounds a little too grandiose, but we're all aware of the idea of enlightenment, right? It's what you're living your normal life, and then all of a sudden you have this awakening. And it doesn't have to be the Buddhist idea of enlightenment. You can be enlightened to anything else. Like, for example, I grew up in a pretty white community, and there was a time when I realized, oh my God, there are people that it's not just on TV that people are discriminated against, or there's, people of color and things like this. When I moved out, and I had to learn, I had to be, become awakened to these different things. And I don't think that you can tell people who are not yet awakened to the idea that we have a big problem coming. If you just say, hey, we have a big problem coming, you need to start doing these things. If they are not already aware of that fact, they're going to shut down and become, a clam. So I like to use what I do to kind of slip the nose under the tent flap and say, like, oh, you like gardening? Oh, that's really cool. Hey, have you ever thought about growing more of your own food? Because, someday we might not. And then you can kind of push people from, like, when I go to the gardening expo, I talk a lot about gardening. And then I start to say, oh, hey, this is why we're doing this, because we want to learn to feed ourselves, and we want to help other people learn to feed themselves so that they're more resilient. I have family that lives in Texas, and I was so glad when we went to visit them this last time. They had a pantry full of food for the first time, just as a backup, because they've had 2 successive food shortages where they were having to scramble to find food. And so now they keep and they cycle food, which is great. I mean, even if you're not growing it yourself, if you have a couple weeks on hand, it really reduces the stress in an otherwise stressful situation. So we are kind of doing what we're calling a transition rubric, lowtechinstitute.org/transition. And it's in beta right now, so it's not full, but basically it's a rubric, and it's suggesting that people have things on hand for either a week, a month, a year, or perpetually in, I think it's 7 or 8 different things, from food and clothing and shelter to community building and waste management. And then you can click on links in that rubric, and it'll bring you to resources to help you, provide your own water, or to at least have filtration on hand. So it's kind of, it's not quite prepping in the classical sense, because it's something you can integrate now and have it as a redundant kind of parallel system. Doesn't mean you have to give up what you have today, but you have that base layer covered if something bad happens. And earlier you mentioned something that made me think about this. The reason we don't do this is that it's not economically viable in the classical economic sense. Having parallel production of energy on our solar panels isn't necessarily, we had to put out a lot of money to start generating our own solar power. We could have just paid a lot of electrical bills for a long time with that. It's not necessarily economically viable, but there's things beyond economic viability that I can't eat economic advantage. I can't eat economic viability, right? And so having parallel systems mean you have something to fall back on. And so it's not necessarily saying you must give up everything today because something's going to change in 5, 10, 25 years. It's saying have all these things in place, be comfortable with them, so that when change happens long term, or when your power goes out because of, everyone turns on the AC and it gives you a blackout in your area, okay, that's fine. We have our backup system, and it's attenuated. It's not the same as living our normal lives, but it's something you're already comfortable with, and it reduces that psychological break. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think, unless people are aware of these sorts of things or thinking along these lines, they're just not. It's really hard to get them receptive unless you pull them in with something else they're already interested in, like gardening.
Yep. Yeah, but in some ways,
I don't have a great answer.
No, but in some ways, it's a nice set of activities that people can enjoy without you know, not just because of the reason of like risk or collapse. I mean, they're enjoyable in and of themselves, in moderation, and when you're not under the gun to learn them and do them. I have one final question, which is, this is so cool. Everything you're doing is so cool. I'm so glad we met. Like, I mean, this is, I think for a lot of us, a lot of people are just getting started, and what a great resource. I can't wait to have everybody pointed to your website and look at all of this stuff you're doing and get involved and take courses and all of this stuff. I'm
Please.
wondering your sense of the state of people getting into this. Has, you know, how has it been, you know, however long you've been doing it, is it changing over time? Like, what is the state now in terms of different people showing interest at different levels, you know, whether it's just regular people or like, you know, organizations, and then where do you see it going? I'm curious, like, your assessment of the social state of things.
I wish I could channel more of the optimist, because it seems like people, I hate to say that people react to fear, but it's easier to react to fear than it is to proactive. Okay, you guys have taught or do teach at the collegiate level. I did. I know when people do their term papers, I can tell. You open up that document, you can see when it was created. Don't do that, because you will be disappointed as a college professor seeing how late people started these stupid term papers. Anyway, so I do worry that sometimes until people are under pressure, they're not going to think about these things, and then it's too late. So every year there are little things that happen that push a few people into this understanding, awakening, or whatever you want to call it. So for example, Texas power outages, that's one. Because I can point to that. There's now, you know, the Ukraine and Russia. I just did our next podcast is going to be talking about the coming wheat crisis, because Russia and Ukraine grow 15 to 19% of exported wheat in the world. China grows the most wheat, but they eat it all, and they've had floods, so they're going to have to import wheat this year. India was going to export wheat, but they just had a major drought, heat wave that killed off a lot of their spring wheat. They are not going to be able to grow eat most of their own wheat. They're going to have to import instead of export like they had planned. We are going to have a huge surge in wheat prices on top of already surging fertilizer prices, which is going to cause everything else to go up. Anyway, all these little things, current affairs happening all the time. Each one of them pushes a few more people to start thinking about these things. Last year, I didn't have anybody sign up for my harvest and process your own wheat class. It may have been due to marketing and not getting the word out early enough. I anticipate this year to have a lot more people coming and learning how to harvest and process their own wheat. Not that they're necessarily going to do it, but that they want to at least have some palpable connection with that. And so every year there's something new, unfortunately, because it takes these crises sometimes to wake people up. It's kind of a slap in the face that snaps you out of your dream that everything is just going to keep floating along as it is forever, because it's not. It never has. And so yeah, I try and use these as a catalyst, and you try and read. It's like the starfish walking down you're walking down the beach and you're throwing the starfish in, and you can't save them all, but you can save the ones that you can. Not to be too messianic about it at all. That's not what I mean at all. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, this is so great. I'm so glad we met. We're obviously allies, so like let's stay in the same constellation together. We can support one another, and yeah. Any last comments, Josh?
I'm good. I just want to plug the lowtechinstitute.org, and I don't know, Scott, if you've got any other stuff that you want to shill, or you just want to mention if you've got an upcoming processing course that is people can time for. You got anything else coming up, say in the next few months, that you want to let people know about?
Well, I don't want to get the cart before the horse, but we just are having our first interns come on board, one to focus on the podcast and one to focus on videos. So I think our podcast, the Low Tech Podcasts, and our videos on, if you just go to YouTube and type in Low Tech Institute, will come up, should take on not only more regular appearance, but also more exciting auditory and visual experience. So we were hoping to get a lot of those out this year. So yeah, check those out. Our website, yeah, like you said, lowtechinstitute.org. We always have stuff going on. We're on Twitter and Instagram. Oh yeah, great thing on Instagram. I want to mention this. We are doing a 100 days, 100 hours of gardening challenge. So if you spend a lot of time in the garden, this might be a way for you to be entered in a raffle to win a whole bunch of free seeds and stuff. We have some partners, and we're always looking for more partners. If someone listens to this and you're an organization, you want to donate something as a raffle prize, that'd be wonderful. But yeah, we already have a whole bunch. I have actually, I don't know if this is going out in visual form, but I have right here a box full of seeds from one of our participating sponsors and Snake River Seed Company. So we are, if you are on Instagram, you can basically just join at any time in the next month or two. We'll do the drawings in September, October. So you just hashtag 100 days, 100 hour gardening challenge, or go to our Low Tech Institute on Instagram, and you can find information there. But yeah, you just tag us and that in the first post, and then use the hashtag through the summer. And yeah, you'll be entered to win some stuff. So that should be fun. And getting people, gardening on a more, if you're gardening 100 hours, that's a significant amount of input. So yeah, hopefully we'll get some people thinking a little more seriously about heavy duty gardening. So yeah, it's something to check out. And if you're not there yet, just check out the hashtag and follow along, or tweet, say encouragement to those that are doing it.
Wonderful. Okay, cool. So Scott, nice to meet you. Thank you for coming on. And yeah, we'll be in touch. We'll see you on social media.